What's going on, everyone? Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Ducks Dish podcast. I'm your host, Max Torres, publisher and lead editor of Ducks Digest, covering the Oregon Ducks for Sports Illustrated on Fan Nation. We got a preview pod for you guys today. Ducks gearing up to hit the road to Salt Lake City to take on the Utah Utes. Man, this is a huge matchup. I mean, it feels like we're saying that every week with how the season's gone, but happy to bring on for my guest today, Salt Lake Tribune writer Josh Newman, covering the Utah Utes. Josh, how we doing, man? Thanks for being here.
Doing well, Max. I appreciate you having me.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm really excited for this game. I think even though the Ducks had all the preseason hype, I think people saw that this game was in Salt Lake, especially with it being a game in the South. Teams kind of alternating when they get to do those cross-division games. And there were eyes on this one even in the preseason. So to kind of just start things off, Josh, I think what I wanted to ask you I want to talk about Kyle Whittingham, the Utes head coach, the man in charge of the program. Just kind of tell me what you think he's like as a coach, what it's like being around him, because I feel like he's really underrated nationally, and he always has the Utes playing some really good football down the stretch, no matter what kind of hand he's dealt.
Yeah, no, that's well said. I mean, look, he's sort of I guess you might call him the dean of Pac-12 coaches now. He's in his 17th season. He's been their only head coach since they entered the Pac-12 in 2011. And, this is their, again, 11th season in the Pac-12. But I think for the last probably 6 seasons, every year they're contending for the Pac-12 South. And if they're not contending, the perception is that they should be contending. That's kind of where this program has been. They've won 3 Pac-12 South titles since 2015. They're in line for a 4th if they can either win this game against Oregon or beat Colorado next week or get some help from Arizona State. But that's what it is. I mean, he's really put together a program that has been, consistent and contending. And you're right, they don't get a lot of love nationally. I think part of that is they're in the Pac-12, which doesn't get a lot of love nationally as a whole, as a football conference. I think the fact that Utah is in the Mountain Time Zone and is not in a huge media market, I think that has something to do with it. The fact that they've never been to a Rose Bowl. So there's a lot of things that I think have contributed to the fact that Utah has, not gotten the love nationally. I think personally, I think Kyle Whittingham is criminally underrated in terms of where his program has been and where it is now, and even still where it's going, because this team now, despite contending, is still very, very young.
We're gonna have to see what the Utes look like when they come out to face the Ducks on Saturday. Obviously there's a lot of eyes on this game, given what's happened this season with, Utah's Pac-12 aspirations. Oregon obviously has those Pac-12 aspirations and is looking even further ahead now into the playoffs even. But I say all that to say that Oregon really isn't looking ahead, because every time we talk any kind of playoffs with Mario or any of the players, it's always want to know process. We're focused on the task at hand. Yep. But I think a cool place to kind of start this little preview, Josh, the last time these two teams met, for those that don't know, Pac-12 championship in 2019, Ducks just really took it to the Utes in that game when, their playoff hopes had already been dashed, right, by Arizona State prior to meeting up with the Utes. But the Utes still had a chance to, in a weird year, I guess, just what we're not used to. Utah was the Pac-12's, prime team to go to the playoffs. So I just think so much has happened since these two teams have last met. And I guess I just wanted to ask you, what's the mood like right now, kind of within the Utah fan base, within the Utah program heading into this game?
It's been a very interesting week in terms of those two things. I think the fan base is kind of pre-programmed to be disappointed. You bring up the 2019 Pac-12 title game when Utah was on the doorstep of the college football playoff. They come out and they're down 20-0 at halftime. And Oregon curb stomped Utah in that Pac-12 title game. That was never a game. And other big games in the past under Kyle Whittingham, there's certainly this history of losing big, high-profile, important games. So the fan base is definitely on edge. But it's interesting. I mean, they're on edge. it's a big game, prime time, ABC, Oregon, the whole thing. But then there is this other kind of separate thought process where no matter what happens Saturday, you have to go to the Pac-12 title game and win if you want to go to the Rose Bowl. So there is some sense that I don't want to say that this game Saturday doesn't matter. It just matters more for Oregon because, like you said, Oregon is still playing for the college football playoff. If Oregon wants to go to the college football playoff, they have to win out and finish 12-1, and that's before anything else happens. So, the fan base is kind of, between two or three different thought processes. The team, Kyle Whittingham will tell you, or he did tell us on Monday, that this is just another game. As Mario says, right, we're trying to go 1-0. It's about the process. Let's just get through this week. Then we'll worry about next week. But you talk to some of the players, like we talked to Britton Covey on Monday night, and Covey's career dates back to 2015, right? He's been here forever, and he's played in a lot of big games, and he rattled off 5 or 6 of the big regular season games that he's played in. And credit to Covey, he was willing to admit that, look, we'll prepare for Oregon just like we prepare for any other team, but this is not just a regular game. This is, we're trying to win the Pac-12 South. We are in contention for a Rose Bowl. It's prime time. It's a night game. It's on, big ABC broadcast TV. So, I think the players, or at least some of the players, recognize that this is not just a regular week. And I agree with them. This is not a regular opponent. This is not a regular week. This is high stakes. There is a lot on the line for both these teams. And again, maybe there's more on the line for Oregon, but there's a lot on the line for Utah. If you beat Oregon, you win the Pac-12 South, you're in for the Pac-12 title game. I'm of the belief that, you don't want to have to, hope for the back door. You don't want to have to hope that Oregon State beats Arizona State and you win the South that way. No, you want to take care of your own business and you want to beat Oregon. So it's been a pretty interesting week from, Kyle's perspective, players' perspective, the fans' perspective. I do think the fans are on edge. So it's going to be interesting how this whole thing plays out, and however it plays out, it's going to be interesting what the reaction is from the fan base.
You talk about the fans being on edge, just to kind of give the Oregon perspective of this. I feel like the mood from them is kind of a mixed bag from confidence with, I feel like they really turned a corner after that Stanford loss.
Right.
You talk about getting that big win in UCLA that they could have put away, and then they let them back in, but then they made some really big plays down the stretch that were, positives to draw, and they took care of Colorado handily at home. And then getting that Washington State win, I think, was huge, just with how them being as hot of a team in the Pac-12. But like I'm talking about, the Oregon fans, they know that Utah is dangerous and that they've just been on a tear this year. But I don't know if there was something you wanted to say to that before I got to my next point.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's just, and I've been thinking about this all week. I mean, it's just pretty fascinating the road that Utah took to get to this point. Like, look, back in August when I filled out my preseason Pac-12 poll, I had Utah winning the South just because I thought that Utah was the best team. I thought they were better than USC. I know that a team like UCLA had some preseason hype. I thought Utah was better than all those teams. Charlie Brewer starts the season, gets benched for Cam Rising. Brewer quits. You had Aaron Lowe's death and everything that has gone along with that. And through it all, Utah's here. They are, in line to win the Pac-12 South. So just fascinating. Like, yeah, I thought that Utah would win the Pac-12 South, but nobody could have predicted the road that, that this Utah team would have taken just to get here.
Yeah, I want to stay there for a second. I think, the Charlie Brewer storyline is something super relevant to talk about just when you're looking at how great of a season Cam Rising has had since taking over the reins of the offense. Can you kind of just take us in there for a second, Josh? Just any insight you can kind of share with regard to kind of Charlie Brewer's departure and then the transition here over to Rising?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so for the people that are unfamiliar, Rising won the job last year in the middle of COVID. He lasted 14 offensive snaps before he blew out his right shoulder, his throwing shoulder. So he was done for the year, and they knew that he was going to be out for spring, and the hope was that he would be ready for August camp. And in the middle of that, you go to the transfer portal, you bring in Charlie Brewer as a graduate transfer from Baylor. 44 career games, threw for 9,700 yards, played in a Big 12 championship game, played in a Sugar Bowl. And Brewer had a really good spring, productive spring. And Kyle Whittingham was very effusive in his praise for Brewer. So I think a lot of us thought, and I'm guilty of this too, that yes, it's going to be a quarterback competition, but how is Rising going to compete? He's coming off major shoulder surgery. Brewer did what he did in spring. He has the resume. Like, how is Rising supposed to win the job? We get to August camp and Rising is healthy and Rising is performing at a high level. And Kyle Whittingham throughout camp was telling us, this is legitimately really close. This is probably closer than we thought it was going to be. Went through all of camp like that. It was close. And the deciding factor, which in hindsight, I completely was on board with this when Kyle said it, was the deciding factor was the experience. Rising through 6 passes and, again, 14 offensive snaps. Brewer has 10,000 yards and he's done all these things. So you go with the experience. You get into the season, the offensive line was banged up. Brewer's struggling in the system. We get to game 3. I think it was, I want to say late third quarter or early fourth quarter. Kyle had enough, benches Brewer, brings in Rising. They almost steal this wild triple overtime game at San Diego State. And since that, Rising has just, he had a string of probably a month where he looked better and better and comfortable and more comfortable. And he was in full, firm command of the offense. And that's where they are. You don't generally see a Utah offense putting up 35 points, 38 points. They put 52 on Stanford. You just don't see a Utah offense doing that. And you don't usually have a Utah quarterback, and they've had some good ones. You don't usually get a quarterback at Utah that has a cannon and can go downfield like Rising. So Rising didn't win the job at a camp, but he bided his time. He's bided his time for a long time here. And he's made it happen. There's a lot of reasons why Utah has been this good. And a lot of reasons why Utah is in this position, but Rising is at the very top of the list as to why Utah is here now in contention.
And you would expect, any head coach, I would say, to kind of, it's not a done deal to side with the veteran quarterback, the guy who's played the snaps, who has all of that experience under his belt. But it's kind of an interesting parallel. I don't want to say they're the exact same situations, but since we talk about it now, with Anthony Brown coming in, he saw some time last year, but a lot of people were buzzing about Ty Thompson, highest rated quarterback to ever sign with the Ducks. But in the end, Cristobal and the staff went with the experience in Brown, and and that's helped get them to where they are now. Maybe I think Thompson could have had some flashy plays, if he were given the ball this year. But ultimately, I think one of the biggest pieces of putting together a run like the Ducks have is that experience at the quarterback spot. So it's really cool to watch Rising, kind of turn things around, especially after coming off of a major injury like that. For him to be having the season that he's having is crazy. It's, long journey to get there, like you mentioned, Josh, coming over from Texas. After being a pretty highly touted recruit out of Southern California. And Mario Cristobal was talking about him earlier this week, saying, he was a talented guy. He was someone that we recruited, so we know him well. And I think that's something that's cool about the Pac-12 is that we see a lot of these matchups with, overlap, right? Guys that the opposing schools were recruiting and everything.
Oh, yeah.
And it's a cool dynamic that I think, you probably get it in a lot of other conferences, but it makes the Pac-12 unique. And just since we're talking about the offense, there were some other guys that I wanted to talk about before we got to the defensive side of the ball.
Yep.
You mentioned just the efficiency that this Utah offense is operating at is something that we really haven't seen in a while, I feel like, or it's certainly not the norm in Salt Lake. I think when I think of Kyle Whittingham teams, Utah teams, it's always that defense, that defensive line. But they have some really, really good running backs. I was just checking that Utah Stanford game, I think, when I was driving to Seattle for the Oregon-Washington game, and it just every time I checked it, it was someone ripping off a huge run.
Oh yeah,
just running it up on Stanford. But these aren't your typical Utah running backs. Now you got TJ Pledger, transfer running back that comes in, and these are some guys that are 5'11", 6 foot, north of 200 pounds, in that 215, 220 pound range, just Tell me a little bit about how that's changed the dynamic of this offense and, what they bring to the table.
Yeah, Utah is never short on quality running backs. That's just something that they have, year after year, right? We all remember Zach Moss and the things that he did while he was at Utah. And there's been, just from last year to this year, there's been a lot of change. Last year it was, the late Ty Jordan kind of taking over the room, during that COVID season, and Jordan Wilmore and Devin Brumfield getting their shots. And Mekhi Bernard was a second-year freshman last year, played sparingly. And then you go from that whole thing, Ty Jordan, unfortunately, is no longer with us. Jordan Wilmore transfers, Devin Brumfield transfers. And then, Kyle Whittingham, to his credit, he has really embraced the transfer portal. So you go to the transfer portal, you go get TJ Pledger from Oklahoma. You get Chris Curry from LSU. He was on that vaunted 2019 title team with Joe Burrow at quarterback. And just those guys, Pledger, Curry, and Mekhi Bernard, who was returning, you already looked pretty stout at the position. You go through spring practice, and then you have a guy like Tavion Thomas, who started his career at Cincinnati, went the JUCO route. They get him, I think it was late. It was like mid or late May when they got Tavion Thomas. And you just start looking at Thomas on paper, and it's like, he had a pretty productive time at Cincinnati, had a good COVID season at Independence Community College in Kansas. And the kid's big. He's like 6'2". I think he came in here at like 230 or 232 pounds. He was actually a little overweight, a little out of shape when camp started, but he got that together, and it was pretty clear early in camp that Kyle really liked Tavion Thomas. Again, big kind of, bruising downhill guy, more size, more ceiling, I think, than Pledger or Bernard. And, Tavion Thomas had a nice start to the season in the opener against Weber State, but he couldn't hold on to the ball. All right. The room collectively had a real fumbling problem. Fumbled once against Weber State, fumbled again the next week against BYU. I think he had another fumble against BYU, but that was waved off, because of a penalty. And there was a stretch of 2 or 3 weeks where Tavion Thomas was, he was in the doghouse. If you can't hold on to the ball, you're not going to play for Kyle Whittingham. But in that time, nobody else could hold on to the ball either. They had this chronic, ball security problem. So, it comes back around to Tavion Thomas. And this whole time, Kyle is like indicating that I like this kid. I want to give him the ball. He just has to hold on to it. So he figured out the conditioning. He figured out the ball security. And he's been great ever since. He's run wild on a few teams. He had 14 rushing touchdowns through the first 9 games of the season, one shy of the program record for most rushing touchdowns in a single season. And he's been great. He's been, again, Utah's never short on running backs, and they've got 3 quality guys now led by Thomas. And look, Pledger had a big game against Arizona when Tavion Thomas was out. And Mekhi Bernard has really had his moments. Mekhi Bernard is, of the 3 guys, Mekhi Bernard is very clearly the best in terms of catching the ball out of the backfield. He's got great hands, doesn't drop it. He's pretty good in pass pro. So, the running back situation, it was a bit of a concern early this season, but it's really turned into a huge positive.
214.5 yards per game on the ground is what we're looking at with this Utah offense, which is going to make this matchup even more interesting, Josh, because they've proven that they can really move the ball on the ground. Yep. But for Oregon, they've been making some really big strides in the trenches on defense. You look at, obviously, Kayvon Thibodeau is the biggest name on that defensive line, that front 7 group, but he's showing that he can defend against the run really effectively too, which I think has been something fun to watch just in his maturation and his development. Because that's a question that comes up a lot in these pressers I go to with him is, where do you think you can improve? Or the coaches get asked that question too. But with how the defensive line for the Ducks was last year, they were getting gashed all the time. So I think that was a little bit of a question mark for this team, and it's really coming together. That's what Tim DeRuyter's saying is, he's saying we're seeing really how this defense is coming together. But with Utah, they can really sling it with Rising. You talk about Brayton Covey. I know they have a bunch of big options there, but Oregon, I feel like the secondary hasn't been poor per se, but they do give up a lot of yards. And I think that it's going to be really important for this pass rush to show up, for Kayvon Thibodeau to show up like he does, it seems like every week, for them to really try to neutralize this Utah offense, which is red hot. But we've talked a lot about offense here, Josh, and we got to look a little bit on the defensive side of the ball as well here on this preview pod. If you're new here, we're talking with Josh Newman. He's a Utah Utes beat writer for the Salt Lake Tribune. And Josh, so kind of, I feel like a cool place to start here. There's a couple names. Devin Lloyd is, the heart and soul of that defense. I hear about him every time I'm looking into the Utes. So maybe he's a good place to start just when we're looking at kind of what the Utes bring to the table on defense.
Yeah. Devin Lloyd's a great story. He didn't have a ton of recruiting interest coming out of high school near San Diego. I think he wound up as a 3-star. I think he was a safety coming out of high school. He originally committed to UNLV. His only Power 5 offer was Utah, and he wound up at Utah. They saw him immediately. They flipped him from safety to linebacker. And the linebacker room when he first got there was loaded with future NFL guys. And he waited a little bit, and he was ready when his number was called. He had a great season last year. I think there's a real chance that if he had gotten a full 12 games last year instead of just 5, he probably leaves for the NFL, because he was getting 2nd-round grades, 3rd-round grades. He decided to come back for one more year, and he's been great. That kid is everywhere. He is, sideline to sideline, ferocious. He's come off the edge in a few packages. So, Lloyd is, as you said, Lloyd is the heart and soul of that defense. He does, seemingly everything for that defense. It begins and it ends with him. And linebacker is another position where Utah is never short on guys. It's Devin Lloyd and it's Nephi Sewell, who is Noah Sewell's brother, of course. They've got some young guys coming up. They've gotten some high 3-star, 4-star type of guys at linebacker in the last recruiting class. But yeah, Devin Lloyd during spring ball was not shy about why he came back for another year. And look, yes, part of it was, 3rd-round grade is X amount of money versus maybe a 1st-round grade, more money. That's part of it, yes.
Sure.
But he was very clear that he went to the Pac-12 title game in 2018, went back in 2019, couldn't get over the hump. He wants to win something. And I think there's a few guys on this Utah team that could have gone to the NFL and could have been drafted, but they tasted disappointment, and they want to win something. And this is why they came back for high leverage, high stakes, late November, big time games like this.
A lot is on the line for both teams here, like we've said throughout the podcast, and Lloyd's gonna be leading that Utes defense. One other guy that I feel like I want to talk about that I think Oregon fans might be familiar with if you follow the recruiting game, cornerback Clark Phillips. I mean,
Yep.
he's a guy that younger guy that I feel like maybe doesn't get I don't want to say doesn't get enough praise, because I'll be honest, I don't follow Utah as closely as I'd like to. But the thing that's interesting with him, Josh, is his journey. Oregon was right there in it for his recruitment, ends up committing to Ohio State, and then opens things back up, doesn't end up at Ohio State. And then I saw Utah, and I just kind of scratched my head for a second, because that was a really, really highly touted guy, All-American,
Yep.
Whatever accolade you want to throw out there, all kinds of records at La Habra. And I feel like even though Utah develops a lot of guys on defense, they've had some defensive backs go to the league, this recruit in particular is the kind of guy that I feel like Kyle Whittingham doesn't usually get. So can we just talk a little bit about him and kind of what you've seen from him this season?
Yeah. Just to add on to what you said, I mean, no, there was a time where, and we're probably still in that time. I mean, look, Utah does not get a ton of blue chip guys, right? They're not getting 5-star guys. They're not even getting a lot of 4-star guys, but they're starting to get some more 4-star guys. And Clark Phillips was, as you said, committed to Ohio State. Jeff Hafley leaves Ohio State, takes the Boston College job, and Utah hopped right on that. They got, Clark Phillips on the phone. They got his dad on the phone, like, hey, come visit us. That recruitment had gone on for a while. Utah was in there for a long time, and they pounced and they sold it. And, Clark Phillips is the highest rated recruit in the history of this program. To your question, he started 5 games last year during COVID. He has started all 10 games now in 2021. And it's been a bit of a mixed bag. He's been good. I wouldn't say he's been great. He's been very good. He got eaten up a little bit by Drake Jackson, but who didn't Drake Jackson beat up before he got hurt?
Drake London.
Excuse me. Apologies, Drake London.
They got a lot of Drakes in.
They got a lot of Drakes. Excuse me.
No
Drake London ate up Clark Phillips a little bit, but who didn't Drake London tear apart before he got hurt? But Clark Phillips has been very good. He's been a steadying presence in a secondary that is pretty hurt. The secondary right now is pretty thin. They had some injuries early. They appear to have another key injury now going into this game. But, Clark Phillips is there, and he's been steady, and he's been solid. And again, he's been very good for this Utah defense.
It's always, I love recruiting. That's, how I got into this whole field. And it's, how these programs are built, right, in the offseason. When nothing's going on, or on the surface, it looks like nothing's going on in those dog days of summer. These staffs are working their tails off to bring in those next those next big guys to lead the program. I think a good transition here real quick, Josh. I don't want to hurry along too much. I know we talked about 30 minutes, so I want to be respectful of your time. But you mentioned injuries. Obviously, that's a huge part of, any matchup. Can you, just since you bring that up, can you tell us a little bit about, what we're hearing from Utah about on the injury front this week?
Yeah. So, you come out of the Arizona game, and there were at least three key guys were hurt in that game. Fabian Marks is a second-year cornerback who has started 7 games opposite Clark Phillips. He was lost early in that game. We saw him on the field later in crutches and a pretty big boot on his right foot. His status is up in the air. If he can play, enter Zamiah Vaughn, who is another kind of second-year freshman guy, doesn't have a ton of experience. I think Fabian Marks has been steadily improving at that cornerback spot, and he was only in there because a guy by the name of JT Brockton, all Pac-12 cornerback last year, he was hurt early this season. So in comes Fabian Marks. He's been pretty good. He's kind of TBD. Nick Ford, who is their versatile all Pac-12 offensive lineman, he's their usual center. He's been playing left guard. He appeared to pull his hamstring against Arizona. It turns out he has a sinus infection. He's been on a lot of medicine. He was dehydrated. He cramped up. No big deal. He's ready to go. Paul Male, who is, let me think. He's usually the backup center, but he's been starting at center with Ford kicked outside to left guard. Male was also kind of hurt on the final drive against Arizona. We saw him with crutches. So he's another guy who's up in the air. The offensive line has just had so many things. There were injuries late in camp and early in the season in September. There was inexperience, and the offensive line had kind of found its groove here over a 2 or 3 week stretch recently, and now you have this new thing, with Paul Male. So we don't know what the status is there. I think the fact that Ford will go, that's a huge help, because if you lose Ford, that's a big problem, because he's very good, he's very versatile, he does a lot of things. So, and then there's Tavion Thomas. Tavion Thomas did not play against Arizona. I was told that it was a precautionary thing. It wasn't dire. It was precautionary. I expect him to play against Oregon, but Kyle Whittingham did go on local radio in Eugene yesterday, and he kind of said in passing that he's considering Tavion Thomas questionable. We know how college football coaches are. Injuries are always a state secret. Kyle calls Tavion Thomas questionable. We're sitting here on Thursday afternoon. I expect Tavion Thomas to go against Oregon.
All right. That's obviously a pretty big player for the Utes. So we'll have to keep an eye on him to see if he's out there once the players take the field. I have one more big question I wanted to ask, but I don't want to rush off of the defense, which is what we were talking about
No, you're good, man.
before the injuries. So maybe we stick on defense for a little bit longer here.
No
We
problem.
talked about Devin Lloyd in the linebacker room with Nephi Sewell. That'll be a cool brother matchup with him and Noah, even though they won't go head to head because they both play defense, obviously. We got some big names that we came to know here in the secondary. Just, I guess, what else do you think we should know about this Utah defense, and maybe talk a little bit about the trenches, because I feel like they're really known for some defensive line talent as well.
Yeah, I mean, the Utah defensive line, as you said, it's, no matter what the personnel or the graduation losses or, any of that, despite all of that, Utah builds its defense. They are going to stop the run. That's what Utah does. Utah has not, if you want to go by the stats, look, Utah is third in the Pac-12 and 48th nationally in rushing defense at like 135 a game. Not the prototypical type of numbers that Utah's defense generally puts up. And they've had some games where they were great against the run. And then there were games like early in the season against BYU. BYU ran for like 215 on Utah's defense, and we were all stunned because that just doesn't happen. I think Oregon State, who I don't know if they still are, but at the time of the Oregon State game on October 23rd, Oregon State was the number one rushing offense in the Pac-12, and they ran for 260 on Utah, which just doesn't happen. So, I have questions as to whether or not Utah can show up, and is Utah going to stop Travis Dye? Are they going to stop Anthony Brown from going nuts if he tucks it and goes? Help me, what's the freshman kid's name who's playing well? Byron Cardwell.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Byron Cardwell is playing well right now, right? 8 yards a carry, etc. So I'm just, I've been thinking about this all week. I'm having trouble envisioning Utah's defensive line, and Utah's defense as a whole really being able to set the edge, being able to, at least contain Travis Dye and Byron Cardwell. If they can't set the edge, and if they can't at least, look, you're not going to stop those guys entirely, but if you can't do something to contain them, it's going to be a long night.
You look at so many of these games, Josh, I feel like with Oregon's identity and the way they've built their team, Mario Cristobal has built these teams, it's going to be one in the trenches, it sounds like. With both teams liking to run the ball. They both like to run the ball, especially with Oregon. They like to run the ball a lot. We're going to see if Jackson Powers Johnson is going to get some significant time this year. He's a Utah guy, as I'm sure he's a familiar name for you out there. Cristobal told us that he was maybe able to go in, he would be able to go in an emergency situation last week, but with the way this team has been playing along the offensive line, even amidst all the shifting pieces, looks like Brian Walk's going to be out for a couple of weeks. Alex Mirabal just has that group completely gelling. That's why the Ducks have been able to run wild on opponents 2 straight weeks of 300 or more rushing yards. So that'll be a matchup to watch on the offense and defensive sides of the ball. And then can the Ducks get pressure on Cam Rising and slow down these really talented Utah running backs that you mentioned? I wanted to circle back to the question that I kind of wanted to ask that is a little bit more broad, but for this, when people were looking at this game, right, you look at kind of what I like to do is look through both team schedules, kind of see what's going on, some important stats. You look at their schedule and you see them getting Arizona before they face Oregon. Arizona obviously has had a pretty horrendous season, but they got their first win. What was it, like 2 years against a depleted Cal team?
Yeah.
But man, they gave Utah a run for their money. So my question for you, do you think that says more about Arizona or Utah, and kind of where, how much concern do you think could really be drawn, or what can be made of that game?
I think that football is, no matter the level, whether it be college or the NFL, I really feel like football is a sport where your fortunes can change week to week. All right. This isn't, the NBA when you're playing 3 games in 5 days and you're moving. Football, you play a game on Saturday, you do the film, you make corrections, and you can be a completely different team the next week. Utah beats Stanford 52-7. Then they go to Arizona. I didn't walk into Arizona thinking that Utah would score 52 again. I thought that they would be in control. I thought the score might be lopsided. Definitely didn't think we would get what we got, like a 2-point game with about 10 minutes to go. Utah needs to go on a 15-play drive just to seal up the game. So what to make of that? I mean, I think Arizona, I thought they were feeling good coming off the Cal win, no matter the COVID stuff that Cal was dealing with. You won a football game, and that gives you confidence, and you're playing well. Was Utah overlooking Arizona, looking ahead to Oregon? I would like to think not, but these are 20, 21-year-old kids who knows what's going on in their head. I mean, what do you take away from it? There's two levels of thinking with Utah coming out of that game. Either you played down to your opponent, which, all right, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that, or you found some trouble and you found your way out of trouble. It was a game in the fourth quarter. You had the long drive at the end, capped off by a TJ Pledger touchdown, and you got out of there with a 9-point win on the road, conference opponent, November. Utah is, probably was Arizona's Super Bowl, so to speak, given how good Utah's been. So I don't know. I mean, I don't necessarily think there's correlation between, playing well at Stanford, playing down to Arizona, nor do I think that there should be any correlation between, playing down to Arizona and then whatever happens on Saturday. I mean, I really think it's just a week-to-week sport.
That's a great point. I think it definitely sheds some light on just maybe the chaos that we see in college football on what feels like a weekly basis. Do we get more of that in the Pac-12 than in the rest of the conference? Probably. That was a point that I talked about on the Washington State preview podcast, just the whole Pac-12 after dark concept. But
right.
Kind of wanted to pick your brain there and kind of just see what you made of it. So I appreciate the insight there. I kind of wanted to put you on the spot a little bit here, Josh. I meant to ask to run you down through this before we hit record, but I kind of wanted to try to do something a little bit new here on the podcast and roll out maybe like a prediction. I know since I'm putting you on the spot here, you don't have to go with a final score if you don't want. I have one prepared because I had a story out on it on my site, but I kind of just wanted to throw that your way and see, ultimately how you think this one's going to shake out when all things are said and done.
Yeah, I genuinely, I've really gone back and forth and I've thought about it a lot, and I've tried to, be objective from all angles, thinking about, what's at stake for Utah, thinking about what's at stake for Oregon. Utah is home where they're generally very good. Night game. The place is going to be sold out for the 69th straight time, going back a decade. There's a lot at stake for Oregon, as we said at the top. Oregon is in line for the college football playoff. They have to win out. There are things on the line for Utah, but it's not as dire a situation as it is for Oregon. As I've said, Utah's secondary is thin. There are questions at a couple of offensive line spots. What does Utah do about Kayvon Thibodeau? I just keep coming back. I don't know. It feels like an Oregon win. And I'm not going to cop out. I'll come up with a score. Let's go 34-24 Oregon. I think it's going to be respectable. I don't think Oregon's going to blow them out by any means, but I do think Oregon is looking a little better lately, right? They had the grind it out win in the rain at Washington. As you said, they dealt with a pretty hot Washington State team. I don't know. It just feels like Mario Cristobal has them playing well, has them playing at a high level, and I think we're going to see that Saturday night.
Utah sounds like they're dealing with some question marks and a couple of different position groups. Josh, yeah, and I mean I'm trying to be objective about it as well. I feel like when you're covering a team like Oregon, maybe some people just expect you to always pick for the Ducks, especially with how they've been playing this year. I actually predicted that UCLA would win in that game, and then everyone knows obviously Oregon went down to Pasadena and took care of business, won that game, even though it was close at the end. I haven't been the best at predicting games, and I'll openly say that because I'm still working on that. But my prediction for this one, I'm going Oregon 38, Utah 31. So I'm kind of in a similar vein there, Josh. I don't think this is going to be a blowout, but there's definitely some reasons to be confident in both teams. I think when you look at obviously the momentum for both of them, I feel like even though Oregon's pretty hot, they have had some close games that, maybe you'd like to see them win a little bit more. But like we've heard from the players and the coaches, you never apologize for winning, right? Even
Nope.
if you just got to take care of business. But I think when you look at the road aspect for Oregon, they're looking at it as a business trip. This team's been very battle tested, and they got it early on in the year when they went down to Columbus and won a game that nobody probably gave them a shot at. And then without Justin Flo and Kayvon Thibodeau, that was just amazing. And I think that you look at that game, you look at some of the other games, Washington, that was a crazy game. I was at that one. And then also UCLA, Stanford obviously didn't end how they wanted to, but they're battle tested. They have momentum. I think they're really finding their stride. They're getting some guys back, even though they've been battling injuries, literally the entire season. It feels like there hasn't been a 1 week where we're like, okay, they're feeling pretty healthy. I think they're doing all right now. But obviously, had some pretty significant injuries to guys like Drew Mathis, who might actually come back for the postseason. We're hearing Bennett Williams, Justin Flo. So just to see, I feel like every week we're seeing this team take some steps forward on both sides of the ball and really getting close on zeroing in on that potential, that full potential. So I'm going to go 38-31. If you're listening to this and you want to see the rest of our team's predictions, you can head on over to ducksdigest.com. Josh, before we get out of here, are there any other points you feel like you want to hit on or that we maybe didn't get to in this podcast yet?
No, I think we covered most of it. I mean, the one thing I will say that I don't think we brought up is that Cam Rising hasn't been sacked in 5 games. It's been a long time since he got sacked. I think that's a combination of the offensive line really came together, really playing well, and I think Rising is also very capable of tucking the ball and going. He's not afraid to get out in the open field. I think he should slide more, but that's a topic for another day. Very smart, very savvy, very capable quarterback. Hasn't been sacked in a long time. And by the way, the most ferocious edge rusher in the nation is coming to Rice Eccles on Saturday. So that part of it, Thibodeau against Rising in the offensive line, should be pretty fascinating.
I appreciate you bringing that stat up. That's definitely something that I think is worth knowing. And this one, I was watching the Utah Arizona highlights, and he's not a fast guy per se, but he's got some wiggle to him, and I feel like he's I think it was 4 rushing touchdowns on the year, so not like a speedster, but I kind of think of him, a little bit like there's quarterbacks in the NFL that aren't dual threat, but they're mobile, right? They know how to extend plays, they know how to avoid the pressure, and then when to tuck it and when to kind of just get out of trouble. And Rising definitely looks like he's got a good head on his shoulders in that regard. Well, before we head out on this last point, my gosh, my brain's mush today. Apologies, everybody. Before we head out here, Josh, where can people find more of you and your work? I know that a lot of Oregon fans are looking for Utah content, which you can find on my site, but I know you got a lot of great stuff coming out in your own right.
Yeah, I appreciate that. My Twitter handle is Joshua_Newman. I link everything on there, or you can go directly to the Salt Lake Tribune website. That's sltrib.com/sports. We'll have it all there.
All right. You guys know where to find Josh. If you want to find more of me, you can follow me on Twitter at that name on your screen at mtorresports. This episode of the Ducks Dish podcast will be on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, as well as YouTube. So if you want to see both Josh and I as we break down this matchup, that multi-platform excellence, head on over to my YouTube channel, Oregon Football Max Torres. Ask that you take a second to subscribe. It really helps me keep doing my thing. But that's all we have for this episode of the Ducks Dish podcast. A big thanks to Josh for coming on to preview Oregon versus Utah. We'll see you guys after the game on Saturday. Should be a good one out in Salt Lake. Take care.